This is for black men and women of South Africa, where it took so much longer than civil rights did in America. They were trapped in a world where it was seen as anathema, to be treated by white people as in the same caliber. And 38 women were failed by society, by incompetent police with a bigoted anxiety, because they felt threatened by black women's strength and sobriety. Finally, arrogance ended Sithole's notoriety. We will remember them as people, not just as victims of Sithole. And pray it never happens again. By God and all that is holy.
Hello and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Prash's Murder Map. I hope you enjoyed the beautiful African music at the beginning of the episode, which really was very emotive and immersive. The poem you heard was written by my talented wife Melissa and was wonderfully read by the amazing voice actor Nicholas Mannie. Today we're going to board a plane and jet across the world to South Africa in the early 1990s. Well known as home to some of the most unspoiled landscapes on earth, mountains, mining industry, and national parks filled with majestic animals like lions, giraffes and gazelles, it also bears the pockmarks of the sordid history of apartheid, the official segregation and systematic victimization of black citizens between 1948 and 1994. So it's a beautiful, wondrous country with a rather sad and bloody past. It was in the context of a newly free South Africa that a series of horrifying murders took place. Although apartheid was officially over, society was still far from equal, and to well-off predominantly white police forces, the disappearances of black women from poor backgrounds were probably not taken as seriously at first as they should have been. But the story actually begins a few years before, in 1987. 38-year-old Patricia Khumalo needed a job, and quickly. When a charming young man calling himself Martin approached her, complaining bitterly that a woman he had hired to work for him hadn't shown up, Patricia felt like she'd hit the jackpot. She assumed Martin was a recruitment consultant, and after a friendly chat, he offered her the vacant position and invited to go with him on the train to the business's premises. When the train stopped, he suggested they take a shortcut through the field. After a few minutes, when they were out of sight and seemingly in the middle of nowhere, Patricia became suspicious. Where was this company where Martin had promised her a job? She couldn't see any buildings for miles. Suddenly, the man's personality changed. His pleasant demeanour slipped, and a look of violence and hatred flashed in his eyes.
"Give me your wedding ring."
Trembling with fear, she handed it over, praying he would let her go unharmed. But he tied her up with her bra and sexually assaulted her before disappearing across the South African grasslands known as the Veldt. What a monster this man was to promise someone a job in a desperate financial situation, to then strip away their dignity and to leave her feeling so isolated, scared and traumatised that she was too fearful to report the sickening crime. And can you blame her for feeling that way? In the socio-political atmosphere in South Africa at the time, would the police really have given a damn? They'd have likely said, "It's just a k***'s argument or a misunderstanding between them." The details of her ordeal and that of many other women would only come to light much later. Almost a year after this, a similar attack took place, showing that this criminal, whoever he was, had good impulse control to wait so long before trying again. This time he called himself Samson. Unlike the biblical story where Samson gets his strength from his long hair, gifted to him by God, this Samson's strength came from his ability to trick people. He approached a woman with a job offer in the same way as before. His chosen victim was already employed, but she eagerly told him her friend, 27-year-old Dorcas Kubane, needed work. There would always be a ready supply of victims like her, as jobs were hard to come by for black people who were restricted from travelling in certain areas and mostly stuck to the limits of their own township. In an almost identical method to his assault of Patricia Kumalo, he lured Dorcas onto a train to the Cleveland area and walked her through the veldt, where he switched like lightning from being friendly and professional to unpredictable and violent. He threatened her with a knife and sexually assaulted her before trying to beat her and assault her again, but he was scared off by the sound of a dog walker nearby and ran. Just like Patricia, Dorcas did not report the rape. Even today, only 230 out of 1,000 sexual assaults are reported to the police, and the conviction rate is extremely low, with less than 5 out of 1,000 perpetrators put behind bars. So we can understand why these women were so reluctant to come forward, particularly at a time when black people were treated as second-class citizens. The majority of the white Afrikaans police would have happily beaten up any black person they saw without any provocation, so it would have seemed impossible to approach them about such a sensitive issue. Now come on, you tell us everything you know. Or do we have to get Captain Holtz in here? You don't want to meet Captain Holtz. Don't worry, Captain, we'll get him to talk. He'll soon be singing just like a canary. About a month after the attack on Dorcas, the serial rapist preyed next on the 15-year-old sister of his girlfriend. She was too young for him to use the job ruse, so he told her he was taking her to see her sister Sibongile. The fact he even had a girlfriend and was apparently liked by her family proves this man was a dangerous predator, adept at compartmentalizing parts of his life and using the perfect persona for each situation. In this way, he was very much in the mould of Ted Bundy, able to function normally on the outside with a well-mannered, amiable personality, hiding the shadowy monster underneath. Sibongile and her sister knew him as Martin, but of course this wasn't his real name, and it would be a long time before police would find out who he really was. He attacked the 15-year-old on the empty, windswept veldt and assaulted her while making vicious threats.
Don't struggle, or I'll set you on fire with this can of petrol. If you tell anyone about this, I will kill you.
He then escorted her home on the train as if nothing had happened. And even if she was worried about the same fate befalling her sister, she was too terrified to say a word. The fourth sexual assault victim was Boiswa Sagamisa. This time the man called himself Lloyd Thomas and promised he could help her find work in Cleveland. The same horrific scenario was played out, culminating in an attack on the veldt. Boiswa tried to fight back, but he threatened her with a panga, the African name for a curved blade like a machete, and tied her up with her underwear. Afterwards, he told her he hated women because he'd had a daughter who had been poisoned by her mother, but there would never be any proof of this statement. It's interesting he said this as if to justify his actions, so he must have known what he was doing was wrong. He left Boiswa tied up with her coat over her head and threatened to kill her if she reported it to the police. Displaying incredible bravery, Boiswa reported the crime as soon as she managed to escape. At first they couldn't do anything as he'd used an alias, so she didn't know his real name. But in a stroke of luck, she spotted him one day while she was working in Cleveland and was able to point him out to the police. Incredibly, when they picked him up, they put him in the back of the same van that Boiswa was riding in with them. She must have been made to feel like she was guilty of something too, with no respect whatsoever for her privacy or safety. She was simply guilty of being a black woman in a country that was racist to the core. Her rapist recognised her straight away.
I should have killed you when I had the chance.
But this didn't stop Boissois courageously testifying against him in court, and he was sentenced to 10 years in jail. It was this incarceration that led to an epiphany. He knew he couldn't leave any more women alive to tell the tale. His name was Moses Sithole, and his reign of terror had just begun. Before we talk about his murders, let's take a look at Sithole's backstory. Moses Sithole was born in 1964 to Sophie and Simon Sithole in the township of Vosluras. Although there is no justification for his crimes, his propensity for violence could be explained by the aggression and hostility he would have seen every day growing up. It would have been commonplace to be persecuted by white South Africans, and he would have seen black activists and freedom fighters beaten and arrested just because they dared to call for equality. The very year he was born was the year Nelson Mandela was incarcerated on Robben Island, where he would stay for almost the next 3 decades. Many black people were treated appallingly in prison, and Moses would have just been entering his teenage years when activist Steve Biko was murdered by the police, who, with the help of several lying doctors, who should have been locked up themselves, denied any wrongdoing. Biko's death became a symbol of the unthinkable injustice of apartheid, and although most people today know or at least suspect what really happened, the corrupt South African justice system at the time protected his killers from having to answer for their crimes. So this was the context in which Sithole grew up, an environment where he was continually aware that his race was seen as inferior, and in a country where violence was regularly used by the authorities he was supposed to trust. Yes, thousands of children grow up in these conditions and don't become bad people, but I strongly believe that to understand human psychology better and prevent people becoming murderers in the future, it's important to look at all the jigsaw puzzle pieces that fit together to create the picture of a killer. Moses Sithole was just 6 when his father died, and without his income, the family was evicted from their home, Moses, his mother, and his 5 siblings. Moses would later claim that even before this, his stepsister and alcoholic mother physically abused him, and this breakdown of trust and love from females in his life may explain the origins of his hatred of women. Sophie Sithole could no longer afford to look after her children, so she left them at a police station and threatened to hurt them if they told anyone she was their mother and that she'd abandoned them. Moses bounced from one youth home to another for a couple of years. When he was 8, he ran away and walked for miles through dangerous shantytowns and open veldt to find his mother. Devastatingly, he didn't get the welcome he was hoping for. She told him he wasn't wanted and sent him straight back to the youth home. At such a young age and alone in the world, this would have been the ultimate betrayal by the woman who should have loved and cared for him. At the age of 11, he ran away again, this time from the KwaZulu-Natal home, and walked an astonishing 300 miles to find his older brother Patrick in Vosluras to live with him. He started work young and had various menial jobs, building up his strength as he got older through amateur boxing. He was described by those who knew him as intelligent, friendly and popular with women, and he enjoyed classical music and visiting the library. But people also started to notice his bad temper, and they would lash out if he was rejected in any way. At one point his brother Patrick lost his job and moved out to seek different accommodation. It was now Sithole's turn to be the betrayer instead of the betrayed, and he craftily sold his brother's house and absconded with the profit. After this he made money by taking on odd jobs around the country, for example at a gold mine in Johannesburg. So now we understand a little about Sithole. Let's go back to the timeline to see what happened after he was incarcerated for the assault on Boissois Sagamisa. He didn't serve the full 10-year sentence and was released after only 4 years for good behaviour. He said he was sexually assaulted in prison, in a chilling echo of the experiences he claimed to have undergone at the youth home he'd lived in as a child. Again, without in any way justifying Sithole's monstrous crimes, I think this is important to discuss, as I believe prison should be for rehabilitation, not for revenge. Even those who think prison should be an unpleasant deterrent have to accept that reoffending rates are notoriously high. In South Africa in recent years, the recidivism rates prove that between 50 and 70% of offenders will commit a crime again within 3 years of release. Clearly the prison system doesn't do what it's meant to, and there's good evidence out there that educational and rehabilitation programs can reduce reoffending rates by almost 30%. In any case, Sithole gave every impression that he intended to live a normal life on release. He married a woman called Martha, whom he'd met in jail while she was visiting another inmate. He convinced her he was innocent and started working for her brother-in-law in his mechanic's workshop. To all appearances, he had turned over a new leaf, until one day, the urge returned. He got sick of his labouring job, smartened up, shined his shoes, and went out to look for different work, but not in the way his wife imagined. On the 14th of July 1994, 19-year-old Maria Monama left her home to work in Pretoria. She couldn't believe her luck when a young, friendly businessman approached her and explained that he ran a youth charity fighting human abuse. He seemed a bit arrogant and overly sure of himself, but he was easygoing and had a good sense of humour to go with it. It sounds just like the ruse from his earlier days, but with one big difference. Rape was no longer enough. Sithole had graduated to murder. Maria's body was found 2 days later in the veldt in the Cleveland area. The cause of death was strangulation. Unknown to his wife, Sithole had recently started an affair with a woman called Amanda Tete. On the 2nd of August 1994, Amanda told her family she was going out to pay some bills and then to go on to her teaching job in Pretoria, but that night she never came home. Her parents were frantic and reported her disappearance to the police. The police officer said they couldn't report it as they didn't have the necessary paperwork and suggested they try at Krugersdorp station instead. Amanda's parents did so but heard nothing for a couple of weeks. They went back to the station to inquire about the progress in searching for their missing daughter and were told the paperwork had been lost. Was this sheer incompetence, or a vestige of the government-sanctioned racism that was so hard to shake off after almost half a century of persecuting and brutalising black people? Amanda's father opened the daily newspaper in October that year and had the shock of his life. There was a picture of his daughter with the terrible news that her body had been discovered in a mine in Cleveland. She had been raped and strangled, hands tied behind her back with her own underwear and clothing stuffed in her mouth. She was buried in an unmarked grave as nobody had known who she was. Her parents were now able to identify her. No thanks to the incompetent police who had ignored the missing persons report, and she was reburied with dignity 2 months after she should have been. To add to the criticism of the police, Amanda's credit card had been used at an ATM after she went missing, and the man using it was captured on a CCTV image. This would be useful later in proving the killer's guilt, so why didn't the police bother to investigate it sooner? In a sinister twist, the brash and confident Moses Sithole turned up at Amanda's funeral, eager to insert himself into the event to savour what he had done, almost like tasting a delicious treat. In the time between killing Amanda and attending her funeral, he'd been busy again. Joyce Mashabele left her home in Yeovil in August to visit her sister, but was never seen again. On the 14th of August, a man calling himself Moses Seema contacted Joyce's workplace and told her manager he had found her ID in a field, and it was arranged for him to meet with her family to give it to them. He was deliberately vague about where he'd found it. 5 days later, Joyce's body was found in Lotus Gardens, Pretoria, sexually assaulted and strangled, just like Maria Monama and Amanda Tete. I think it's safe to say that Moses Sima was Moses Sithole, yet again injecting himself into the action with audacity and a fake name, taking pleasure in the fruits of his crimes. Several more victims were found in 1994, and this is where it gets difficult to explain the timeline accurately, as Sithole was such a prolific killer, and some women's bodies were found months after they first went missing. It was 3 months before Amanda Mokali's body was identified, and shortly afterwards, Rose Mogodzi was found dead towards the end of the year after going missing on the 15th of September, telling her family she was going to meet a man to discuss a job opportunity. The police's poor administration didn't help, and many more of the identifications were delayed before the case would finally be closed. In September of 1994, the Brixton Murder and Robbery Unit was established as a task force to investigate the disturbing murders spanning the Cleveland and Pretoria regions. With the help of Robert Ressler from the FBI, a profile of the murderer was created. A tip from a member of the public soon led to an arrest, but it wasn't of Moses Sithole. David Selepe was a failing businessman with creditors baying at his door, and police claimed to have found newspaper clippings about the killings in the boot of his car, along with drops of blood. Apparently, he admitted to all the murders so far, which totaled 15 by that time. He professed to having 2 accomplices, Mandler and Tito. Police tracked down the man called Mandler, but after interviewing him, they dismissed the accomplice story, believing that Selepe had acted alone. The CCTV footage of a man using Amanda Tete's bank card was finally examined, and using some dubious facial recognition techniques, they confirmed it was Selepe. Then things got weird. Police ordered him to show them the murder sites, and strangely enough, he was able to point out one of the sites accurately, the spot where Amanda Tete was killed. While he was being taken out to show detectives the murder sites, David Selepe made a break for freedom and was shot dead. I wonder whether this was true, or if the police invented this story to mask an intentional killing. Maybe they really believed he was guilty, or maybe they were under pressure from above to solve the case. But if it was deliberate, it was a foolish move. Just a few months later, it became clear they got the wrong man. By April 1995, 4 more bodies had been found. The killer was still at large, and he had evolved, now using a garrote to leverage the strangulation with the victim's pantyhose. Mickey Pistorius, recognised as one of the leading experts on psychological profiling, and the aunt of controversial Paralympic sprinter Oscar Pistorius, felt this was a natural progression for the killer, giving him greater control over life and death, strangling then releasing the victim to prolong the ordeal and his own sadistic gratification. As these latest murders had been in the Atteridgeville area of Pretoria, police still argued that Selepe was guilty of the ones in Cleveland, but then they would say that, as it wouldn't look good if they'd got it wrong and shot an innocent man. A new task force was created in July 1995, and bodies were being discovered so frequently that it was impossible to keep up with the savagery. 21-year-old Granny Romilla was found in a forest, raped and garroted. Francina Sitebe had left work on the 13th of June and was spotted later that day sitting up against a tree. When a man out for a walk approached her, he realised she wasn't moving. She was dead, tied to the tree by her neck, with a handbag strap and underwear. It was a dramatic evolution. The killer had escalated from using normal strangulation techniques to garroting to control the airflow, and then left his victims in the open, apparently making no attempt to hide the bodies. He was calm, confident, and extremely dangerous. By September 1995, another 3 bodies were discovered. By now, Sithole had split from his wife Martha and was homeless, spending most of his nights sleeping at a Johannesburg train station. This was an ideal location to stalk his victims, as he could watch women coming and going on public transport. There was now an influx of people seeking work, as black citizens could finally travel more freely from place to place than they could during apartheid. Sithole's guile inflated, along with his malignant ego, as his formula for enticing women to a job prospect amplified. He sweet-talked a secretary at Afrox, the company where he was temping, to create a letterhead for his organisation, Youth Against Human Abuse. Of course, unbeknownst to the secretary, this charity did not exist. With a professional letterhead and a newly designed job application form, Sithole now had even more tools in his nightmarish inventory to make his victims believe he was running a genuine business and add credence to the job offers. One of the first victims he tested the improved ruse on was Mildred Lepule. She was offered the chance to go for an admin job at Youth Against Human Abuse and was interviewed over the phone by a Professor Williams. You've guessed it, Moses Sithole. Then a man called Phiri, Moses again, phoned her. He congratulated her on her performance and invited her to a face-to-face meeting. On the 30th of May 1995, Mildred's husband dropped her off in Moulin Street, Pretoria, for her interview. It was the last time he saw his wife alive. Her body was found on the 26th of July near a railway line, raped, strangled, with her pantyhose, and as if her dignity had not been violated enough, her underwear was pulled over her head, maybe as a lurid act of humiliation. The increasingly egotistical Sithole invited Elsie Coty to meet him about a job at his real place of work, Afrox. A couple of weeks later, she was found like the others, hands bound behind her back, strangled, with her handbag strap and a cloth wrapped around her face. Over the next month, more bodies were found, but tragically some were never identified. It seemed impossible that the situation could get worse, but it did. The case darkened when police reservist Solomon Kunwane was walking his dogs in the Van Dyke mine area in Boksburg on his day off. His dogs picked up a scent and he wondered what they had found.
Come on. Hey, come on now. What can you smell?
The answer was disquieting. It was rotting flesh. Kunwane had unwittingly stumbled across one of Sithole's dumping grounds, as there were 10 female bodies in various stages of decomposition. Police once again blundered by allowing a photo and article to be printed in the newspapers. Sithole now knew his favourite spot had been uncovered, so he would never return there. If they had kept it quiet and staked out the area, they might have been able to catch him sooner. Media reports stirred up such a frenzy that President Nelson Mandela postponed his trip to visit the Van Dyke site and called for any information and help the public could give. Helicopters scoured the area from above, taking pictures and videos of the scene, and an entomologist was brought in who had developed a technique to establish times of death using insect larvae. By the way, if any of you listeners have an interest in forensic techniques involving insects in murder cases, you should definitely watch the film Phenomena, starring Jennifer Connelly and directed by Italian film legend Dario Argento. He brings murder and insects together in a very unique way using masterful cinematography. As film is another one of my hobbies, I'll actually be talking about some more of his films pertaining to murder in my bonus content on Patreon, so please do check that out. So, warned away from the Van Dyke mine area in Ondresdeput, and excited by the coverage he was receiving, Sithole reverted to his previous killing territory in Cleveland. Yet another task force was set up under the East Rand Murder and Robbery Unit, headed by Captain Franz Niekirk, but they still maintained Sithole was responsible for the original Cleveland murders. 4 of the 10 victims found in the Van Dyke mine were never identified, but when police questioned the families and friends of the other 6, the killer's patterns began to emerge. He always used a similar MO, approaching the women with a job offer at the fake charity Youth Against Human Abuse. One of the victim's family members had more to add. 31-year-old Monica Vilikazi had left home on the 12th of September to attend an interview. When police visited her grandmother, who Monica had lived with, to break the dreadful news, she explained that the day before her granddaughter disappeared, she'd had a phone call from a man passing on some information about the interview.
Hello. Oh, Monica is out. Will you give her a message to come on the 12th of September for her interview? Yes, that's right. It's Youth Against Human Abuse. 10 o'clock. Yes, my name is Moses Sithole.
His confidence had reached such a zenith that he was now using his own name as if he was untouchable, and it's easy to see why, as he had killed at least 30 people and the police had so far been powerless to stop him. Eventually, overconfidence becomes a serial killer's undoing, and here we see another parallel with Ted Bundy, who also grew increasingly brazen and eventually made mistakes. Horribly, Sithole followed up his latest murder with phone calls to Monica's grandmother in the next few days, inquiring as to her whereabouts. He gave different names on these occasions, but her grandmother recognised his voice as the same man who had called about the interview. He was probably reliving the murders and made the calls not just to torment the victim's family, but to relish the excitement of knowing he had caused Monica's death. It was as if he wanted people to know about his crimes, a desire probably fueled by the media coverage of the horrific discovery in the mine. He even visited charities such as Kids Haven and volunteered his services. Once he had the temerity to bring them 2 children he'd found on the street with a photographer in tow so that they could take pictures of his benevolent act and promote his own fake charity. Now that Sithole had given out his real name, police were closer to catching him. His name and identity were confirmed, and an identikit picture published on the front page of the newspapers, the only kind of publicity he didn't want. He'd been using his sister's phone number on the fake letterheads, and when police questioned her, she admitted she'd been receiving calls from women looking for work and wanting to speak to Moses. She hadn't seen her brother in a few months and only ever spoke to him over the phone. So they knew who he was, but they had one big problem. Where was he? Meanwhile, Sithole just couldn't stop killing and pursuing notoriety. On the 3rd of October, he rang Tamsin De Beer, a journalist at the Star newspaper, and said,
I am the man that everyone is looking for.
Tamsin tried to gain his trust and convinced him to call again the next day, alerting the police so they could put a trace on the line. Sithole offered information about his victims and methods, and even revealed the location of 2 bodies the police didn't know about yet. But he got suspicious and hung up too quickly for his location to be triangulated. The 2 victims he mentioned were found exactly as he'd promised. One woman was discovered near Jupiter Station on East Strand under a sheet of corrugated iron, but she'd been there so long that only her skeleton remained, and she was never identified. The other was 31-year-old Beauty Nebene, who went missing in Soweto on the 10th of October and had been garroted. Sithole had a burning need to tell the world about his kills, and had highlighted his power further by slaying Beauty around the exact time frame he was in communication with the journalist. Another woman was found dead in mid-October, tied to a tree by her neck with her shoelaces. Note that he didn't bring any of his own equipment other than a weapon like a garrote, and seemed to take pleasure in using the victim's own belongings, clothes and underwear to strangle them. Shortly after this, things came to a climax when Moses contacted his sister and asked her husband to bring him a gun for protection. He was getting paranoid and realised that he wasn't so untouchable after all. His sister agreed to meet him at a factory on the 18th of October. She contacted the police about the plan, and an undercover officer posed as one of the company's security guards. Moses, with an almost sixth sense for his own preservation, knew something was wrong and ran. The undercover policeman chased him down an alleyway, but Moses was carrying an axe and struck and wounded the officer twice. The officer got off 2 shots and hit the killer in the leg and stomach before taking him into custody. Unlike with David Selepe the year before, he survived the bullet wounds and was soon fit enough for questioning. Sithole refused to talk unless a female officer was present, maybe wanting to revel in the details of his crimes in front of her and make her feel uncomfortable. The minute a policewoman arrived, he explained everything, obviously desperate for an audience, just as he had been with the newspapers, and even contacting the grandmother of one of the victims. The other officer interrogating Sithole was celebrated South African super cop Piet Billeveld, who died in 2017 after a long and storied career. He was also known for catching the hammer killer, Cedric Marquis, who had multiple MOs and slaughtered 27 victims, both young and old, and male and female, which is very unusual, as serial killers usually target victims with similar demographics and features. Billeveld had a 100% record, caught 9 high-profile murderers during his career, and was even consulted by London Scotland Yard, America's FBI, and Canada's RCMP. Billeveld had joined the force in 1972 after deciding to swap his church deacon robes for a police uniform. When interviewed, he said, "It was never my intention to become a hero or be placed on some kind of pedestal. I simply did my job and never expected the recognition I received later on." Moses Sithole, aka the South African Strangler, or in my opinion, the Black Ted Bundy, was charged with 38 counts of murder. Despite having already confessed, he stood in court grinning superciliously and pleaded not guilty to every charge. A psychologist assessed him as being of completely sound mind at the time of the murders. Rightly so, because the fact he was calm and collected enough after each attack to go home on the train as if nothing had happened proved his premeditation. Maybe he even chose the MO of strangulation for this very reason. He knew he would need to take public transport back home, and a bloodier method such as stabbing would have left stains that others would have noticed. The trial commenced in October 1996, a full year after Sithole's arrest. Police now realised that he was responsible for the victims originally attributed to Selepe and proved it with forensics. The scene in court was chaotic, with officials sealing it off from the public with barbed wire, fearing that the crowds of indignant women chanting, "Sithole, why are you killing us?" would tear him limb from limb if they got the chance. His crimes had shocked the nation and were an insult to women everywhere. Despite his obvious guilt, his defence tried to suggest he'd been coerced into a confession. Sithole also attempted to justify himself by saying he did it because of what he called his unjust incarceration after the attack on Boiswa Sagamisa. The fact he thought it was unjust that he was punished for something he did just shows me that he truly felt above the law and thought extremely highly of himself, probably to the point of narcissistic personality disorder like Ted Bundy. Throughout the trial, he blamed women and the system for his actions, anyone but himself. When the CCTV stills were re-examined of the man using Amanda Tete's bank card, it was finally confirmed that it was Sithole and not Selepe after all, and Sithole's DNA was found on Tete's body. Joyce Mashiabele, whose death had been attributed to Selepe, was also proven to have been killed by Sithole. The story gradually came to light as more witnesses and survivors testified that they'd been approached about a job prospect. In some cases, Sithole had given these women gifts of jewellery. He smirked his way through the testimony of his victims and their families, making a mockery of their strength it must have taken for them to come forward and face their nightmare in human form across the courtroom. But the tables were turned when his ex-wife Martha took the stand. She entered the courtroom holding their young daughter in her arms, and when he saw them, he burst into tears. The crowds heckled and laughed. Was this a sign that deep inside Moses Sithole had some feelings, or was it all just an act to evoke sympathy? The journalist from the Star, who had accompanied him to the Kids Haven charity to photograph him delivering street children to their office, swore that he'd been very convincing and appeared to have a genuine concern and sympathy for the children and their safety. Damningly, Sithole was secretly filmed by a fellow inmate, confessing to his crimes on video, although he only admitted to 29 and claimed not to know who was responsible for the others. It's possible that Selepe really did kill some of the unidentified victims, but I think Sithole killed the majority. He said he had no accomplice and had killed them out of anger, speaking as calmly as if he was relating what he'd had for dinner. He was sentenced to 2,400 years in jail and boasted the most prolific body count of any serial killer in South Africa, spanning just a 2-year period. While in prison, he tested positive for HIV, and his wife and daughter were also found positive. Sithole received excellent health care while incarcerated and is still alive today in jail in Bloemfontein, while in a sad quirk of fate, Martha and their daughter died within 10 years as they could not afford the antiretrovirals they needed. In 2003, a journalist made contact with Sithole to write his biography, but his attitude and behaviour was so startling that she ceased the interviews for her own safety. He was a killer who delighted in the whole process of gaining the victim's trust before killing them. Unlike some murderers such as Paula Gortsov in wartime Germany, a case I covered in my very first episode, who was sickened by the sight of the bodies he left behind, Sithole luxuriated in it and loved every moment of reliving his barbarism. Profiler Mickey Pistorius theorised that this originated from his mother's rejection as a child and a subsequent loss of control in his life, so he tried to regain the control he desired by killing women. So what makes a killer a killer? We know that many people grow up in abusive, dysfunctional families and yet never show any desire to hurt others. But for some reason, maybe a unique combination of societal events, family life and genetics, Moses Sithole's personality was moulded from a young age into what he later became. If the situation in South Africa had been different, and there had been no apartheid, so that black people had equal freedom and opportunities, would he still have murdered? If there had been financial help for his mother to support her children after her husband's death, and Moses had never been sent to youth homes, would his future have been brighter, and the lives of at least 38 women saved? We'll never know. Now, earlier on I mentioned Dario Argento's Phenomena. Now that's worth checking out as a really interesting film. 3 other films I recommend which deal with apartheid in South Africa are Cry Freedom, which stars Denzel Washington, and that's based on real life events. It deals with the relationship between Donald Woods and Steve Biko, and it also deals with his death as well. Another wonderful film is A Dry White Season, which basically depicts a South African man's fight against racism in South Africa, and A Colour of Friendship, which is actually a Disney film which stars Lindsay Hahn, who does a wonderful job of portraying a white South African who arrives in America as a sort of exchange student. So I recommend all those 3 films as being worth watching to try and get a better understanding of what things might have been like during that time period. Thank you for listening to another episode of Prash's Murder Map. Feel free to subscribe on Google Play, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcast. In the meantime, if you wish to connect with me, please visit my website, prashasmurdermap.com, or drop me comments and suggestions to prashasmurdermap@gmail.com. On my next episode, I'll be combining a few different crime stories into a special Murder Minis episode. So until then, take care!